5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, gang, and welcome back to Alien Protocols, the Advanced Protocols Data Project. We have a really special guest, someone who I'm a big personal fan of and have seen a lot of interviews of his, and he's really a true expert in parapsychology and especially in PK and a lot of different aspects of parapsychology. His name is Dr. Stephen Braude. He's the emeritus professor and former chair of the philosophy department at the University of Maryland, served as the president of the Parapsychological Association, author of Limits of Influence, First Person Plural, Crimes of Reason, The Gold Leaf Lady, Immortal Remains, ESP and Psychokinesis, and he's the editor of the Journal of Scientific Exploration. How do you have any time, Dr. Braude?
I don't sleep.
Well, you look great for someone who gets no sleep at all. Thank you so much for your time, first of all. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
This channel deals a lot with the powers of the mind, the powers of the subconscious, and also UFOs. And the followers on our channel know how these two topics kind of interweave a lot. And in fact, recently, the US government released a document, and the document was talking about these advanced aerial vehicles under the ATIP program. I'm sure you're familiar with ATIP, the program with Luis Elizondo was leading. And they found some kind of very stunning discoveries, and they had stated some of their fears about this. These craft having certain abilities, and these abilities, let me read them to you and see if how they hit you, what your reaction to them is. A scenario exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate U.S. facilities, influence decision makers, and compromise national security through such effects as psychotronic weapons, cognitive human interface, penetration of solid objects, instant disassembly of sensors, alteration and manipulation of physical items and biological organisms, and unique cognitive experiences. To me, that sounds like a lot of parapsychological stuff. Does that sound that way to you?
Well, it depends if the effects are being caused by machines or by organisms. If they're caused by creatures, then it sounds very PK-ish.
Mm. You know, a lot of these, they all seem to me to be different aspects of PK and psi. The instant sensory disassembly, psychotronic weapons, even the ability to penetrate solid surfaces, kind of like aports, passing through a solid object. Is there a specific name in parapsychology aside from aports for passing an object through another object?
It's a good question. I would think they're more or less synonymous, but maybe I'm forgetting something at the moment.
It seems very interesting that these craft and these extraterrestrials, if they're inside these craft, might have some of these abilities, and they might have them at an extreme extent to the point where they can manipulate cognitive abilities. They could disassemble sensors. Of course, that's very extreme compared to the human ability, but do you think that is a possibility that they are utilizing extreme psi?
Well, I think the deeper question is perhaps just how far can psi abilities go in principle? And that's something we don't know. I mean, we know so little really about the limits of PK or ESP for that matter, that I think it's intellectually responsibility at this stage in our ignorance to open the door in principle, even as a thought experiment, to the paranormal, and then decide more or less arbitrarily only to open the door just a crack. I think at this stage of our ignorance, if we open the door to the paranormal, we at least have to be prepared to open it all the way.
So speaking of, how powerful could they be? What are some of the most powerful cases that you've actually witnessed? Out of cases that you've witnessed, what are some of the most powerful psychics or events that you've seen?
Well, I wish I could say that the cases I've personally investigated are as dramatic as some of the greatest ones reported in the history of parapsychology. They don't quite reach that level of that boggle threshold. But without question, the most interesting case I personally investigated was the case of the gold leaf lady. This was a woman in eastern Florida whose body would break out spontaneously and instantaneously in a kind of golden colored foil. And she was a good all-around psychic. Although she was functionally illiterate and could only write her name, but not really write any sentences. She had only a first-grade education. When
Wow.
she was in mediumistic trance, she would write out quatrains in medieval Latin and French from Nostradamus.
Wow. Did you see her actually exude the leaf, the gold leaf?
Yes, yes, I did.
And from my recollection of the case, it wasn't actually gold. It was kind of like a bronze. It was a metallic mix. Is that correct?
It was brass, so 80% copper, 20% zinc. And I have to say, it's not clear that she exuded it. I mean, it certainly looks that way. Sometimes her skin would glisten a little bit before the foil appeared, and then suddenly there'd just be this big eruption of foil on her skin. And the reason I say it's not clear she exuded it would be, first of all, she sometimes manifested huge quantities of this. And I think that means if this was something she was sweating, as it were, she'd have to have lethal amounts of copper and zinc in her system. And no medical tests ever revealed any anomaly of that kind. And
Wow.
secondly, sometimes the foil would appear on objects around the room, which I didn't see personally, but I've seen the stuff contained in sealed containers.
Did you see it from her itself?
I'm sorry?
Did you see it happen with her, come off of her itself?
Yes, yes. I mean, I've been sitting across from her at a dinner table, for example, and suddenly there was some stuff on her cheek. And I could see clearly that she hadn't put her hand or anybody else's hand near her face at that time. It was just suddenly there.
Wow. When you were investigating that case, of course, the first thing you're going to think is this is some, trickery of some kind. She's, some sort of sleight of hand of some kind. And I'm sure you were eyeballing that intensely, that your belief didn't prevent you from being skeptical. How did you, what was the final thing that convinced you it was real?
Well, there were several things. First of all, Katie, her name was Katie. She's not a professional psychic. She had no interest in being one. This was really a kind of affliction for her and a source of embarrassment. I mean, you can imagine if she's trying to check out at the 7-Eleven or something like that and stuff appears on her face. What do you say to the cashier? And it was also uncomfortable for her. But more than that, we had her investigated by a magician, and he confirmed what was clear to anybody who took just a moment's reflection. This stuff is very clingy and staticky, so it's very difficult to manipulate and move from one part of your body or from one part of your hand to somewhere else without being detected. And besides that, we would investigate her very carefully. She would come into a room with video cameras trained on her. We would inspect her very clearly. This was Florida, so she had a short sleeve shirt on. We could easily determine there was nothing on her hands or on her arms. We'd ask her to lift up her shirt just below the breasts so we could see that there was nothing on her abdomen or back. And then we talked, and a more intimate examination would be conducted by a physician, her confidant, Bert Schwartz. And we talked to her for a while, and if something didn't appear where we could see it, we'd ask her to lift up her shirt, and more often than not, there'd be foil there, or sometimes just raised welts on the skin, like stigmata, almost in the shape of a butterfly or a cross.
Wow, that's amazing.
I have to say that's not paranormal. That's not clearly paranormal, because we know from the history of hypnosis that people have been able to raise welts on the skin under hypnotic suggestion. So the foil, though, is another story.
What do you think that is? I mean, is that some sort of teleporting I'm at a loss.
I'm at a loss too. What I can say is this: we don't know whether the material is an apport, something that's transported from an art supply store, for example, because this kind of Dutch metal or composition leaf, this brass foil, is often used as a cheap substitute for gilding, real gilding in picture frames. So you can buy it, and I have bought it and had it analyzed by various chemists and compared to Katie's foil. And they are more or less the same. There are minor differences, but nothing significant.
Now that brings up a lot of questions, doesn't it?
Well, we don't know whether it's an apport or whether it's a materialization, something produced de novo, just out of thin air, as it were. What I do know is why it appeared. I think I have something to say about that.
Oh, wow.
And the thing is, Katie didn't discover any of her psychic abilities until she married her current and second husband. And by all accounts, it's a difficult relationship in various ways. So in some ways, Katie fits the classic profile of a poltergeist agent, someone who's got some intense emotional issues, maybe no conventional way to express them or deal with them. And so phenomena occur as a kind of brute psychic flailing about. Now, you don't have to be a teenager or an adolescent to have deep emotional issues. Marriage, as I can attest, can be a fertile ground for those sorts of things. So what happened was that Katie was experiencing actually poltergeist-like phenomena early on in her marriage, and objects were moving around, appearing and disappearing. And one day, a carving set appeared out of nowhere. And Katie's husband said to her, "What good is it if it isn't money?" And then 2 days later, Katie's body started to break out in a kind of golden foil. So if you want my pop psychological analysis of this, it would be that symbolically this satisfies Katie's husband's demand for something valuable, but she doesn't then have to be responsible in the way that the goose that laid the golden egg would be responsible for producing something valuable. And I think also it's a way of expressing her considerable pent-up rage against her husband, because she wasn't really giving him what he wanted. He wanted something valuable, and she was giving him fool's gold. You know, she was giving him the psychic finger.
I would completely believe that, because it makes a lot of sense. Psychologically, that would be her way of expressing herself. And there's been studies done that show that people can have PK unintentionally, and
Yes.
they can affect things retrocausally. There's that famous experiment they did with the martial arts students, and they had the random number generator in front of them, but the numbers were chosen by a random number generator a few days previously, but the students didn't know that. They thought it was in the moment, and they had an ability to indisputably affect the numbers. So somehow they had to affect the numbers retrocausally. So,
well, I'll give you a little trouble with that. I mean, there have been a sequence of experiments ever since Helmut Schmidt conducted some on suggesting backwards causation. What we don't know, I mean, the problem with doing lab tests of PK is that you can't really pin down who is responsible for what. It's not as if we can go around with the PK meter and see where the lines of force are coming from. So for all we know, it may not be the official subject that's producing the effect. It could be the experimenter and producing a large-scale effect, just organizing the future in a certain kind of way. It could be an onlooker, it could be a spectator, or it could be someone apparently unconnected with it, just living in the trunk of an old Studebaker in Gary, Indiana, for all we know.
What's the most powerful case that you've ever heard of someone who had the most power, either the ability to lift the most weight or execute the most powerful type of PK? Of course, Ted Owens was very well known for those lightning bolts. That seems to be very tough to beat. What case histories come to mind?
I would say it's a tie between the case of D.D. Hume in the late 19th century or Carlos Mirabelli in Brazil in the early 20th century. The difference, though, is that Hume's phenomena were probably better attested than Mirabelli's, but Mirabelli's are more spectacular. He could apparently produce full-form human materializations. Physicians would examine the bodies. They would hear the functioning of internal bodily organs, and then the materializations would dissolve into the floor right before their eyes. And this could be in broad daylight.
I've never heard of that case before. Hume was the gentleman who would do the parlor stuff, and he levitated really high and things. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, the levitations are among the least well attested of his phenomena, but there are others that are very well attested. I can give you a good example if you like.
Love to hear him. Love to hear him.
He could apparently make musical instruments play either untouched or at least handled in a way that would ordinarily frustrate musical performance. And he would often carry around an accordion, and people would say that the accordion would float around the room untouched, playing melodies on request, or at least held at the end away from the keys. And Hume said that the phenomena were strongest underneath the seance table, which sounds a little suspicious, but one of his investigators, the physicist William Crookes, was a clever guy, and he said, well, if this is what Hume really believes, we don't want to force him too much out of his comfort zone. We need to find a way to test this phenomenon in a way that is at least more or less congenial to Hume. So here's what he did. First of all, he bought a new accordion. So there was no question about its being a prop that Hume carried with him. Secondly, he went to Hume's apartment, washed and changed clothes to make sure that he wasn't hiding something on his body that could simulate the effect. Although I remind you, this was 1871. It's not clear what kind of miniaturized device that could have been. Then he brought Hume to his house, where he had built a cage made out of wire and wood that just fit under his dining room table. And the accordion was in the cage. There was room for Hume to get his hand under the table and into the cage to hold the accordion at the end away from the keys, but not enough to actually get into the cage to manipulate the accordion. There were 9 observers present, all members of the Royal Society, 2 stationed on either side of Hume to watch and make sure he wasn't taking his feet out of his boots. Another observer under the table with a lamp to watch what's going on inside the cage. Under those conditions, the accordion flopped around, moved in and out, the keys were depressed, sounds came out of the accordion. Then Crookes asked Hume to take his hand out of the cage, put both hands on the table. He ran an electric current through the cage, and the accordion was still flopping around inside the cage.
Wow.
Now, I'd say that's one of the strongest experiments in the history of parapsychology, and no magician has ever tried to duplicate that under conditions anything like those in which Hume succeeded. And I think for good reason.
Wow. Yeah, that's an amazing, amazing case. What do you think is going on? What do you think is causing this? Do you think this is a spiritual thing? Do you think this is strictly a science thing, that it's a nuts and bolts science thing? What do you think is the mechanism at work here?
Well, this was in the heyday of the spiritualist or spiritist movement beginning in the mid-19th century. So all the great mediums during this period were convinced spiritists. And I think that confers a certain psychological advantage. I mean, think of it this way. The medium has nothing to lose no matter what happens. If the medium thinks that he or she is just a vehicle for the phenomena and not an actual cause of them, then there's nothing to lose. So if no phenomena occur, or if only uninteresting phenomena occur, the medium can attribute it to an inept communicator or to a weak link to the spirit world. And more important, if good phenomena occur, the medium doesn't have to think, holy crap, if I can be doing this during the safe confines of a seance, who knows what havoc I might be wreaking when the seance is over, unconsciously. So it tends to frustrate the fear of psi. It takes the medium off the hook, literally.
I've seen this in case history again and again with different famous mediums or psychics where they attribute it to someone else or a middle person.
Right.
Like Ted Owens said it was the praying mantis aliens. And
right.
then some people over time will start that way, attribute it to a being or a spirit, and then over time take ownership of it themselves after maybe 10 years or so. Have you seen that same kind of a phenomena?
Absolutely. And there are parts of the world where people are more or less okay with assuming that they can do these kinds of things. They place hexes on one another and so on. But think of it this way. If I can move, say, a matchstick a millimeter by thought alone, it's a very small step conceptually from doing that to making somebody drop dead by thought alone.
Absolutely. It's a frightening.
So the existence of any PK at all forces us to take seriously a kind of magical worldview that we tend to associate, usually condescendingly, only with so-called undeveloped or primitive cultures. And it's a worldview where thoughts can have all sorts of lethal or other malevolent consequences, and in which we might have to take responsibility for a range of things we would just as soon be bystanders for. I mean, most people in developed countries aren't happy with the idea that if we have nasty thoughts about somebody and that person suffers some serious accident, let's say, that our thoughts might have had some role in the misfortune. But there are other parts of the world where people take that as a matter of course. They erect psychic defenses. and so on.
And, from the studies that I've seen, I'm not certain their empirical nature or not, but it seems like everything from the Maharishi effects to, study after study, the power of intention seems pretty, as far as I'm concerned, indisputable, that it affects the physical world. What is your position on the power of intent?
Well, I
Do
believe
you
that.
think?
Again, like I said, I'm not sure we have a firm grasp of what the limits of those effects can be. And to me, that's a serious open question, just how large scale they can be. We know that there's good evidence for PK effects on machines of various kinds. We don't know just how widespread that is. It might have played a role in the history of science for all we know. I think one of the reasons so many people panic at the idea of talking about PK effects is that it isn't the sort of thing that would happen just for parapsychologists and just when they set out to look for it. It could happen in the course of normal scientific investigation, where a lot of scientists, for example, are hoping for a certain result. They're dealing with very finely tuned equipment that needs constant tweaking to be working properly and could easily be affected by thoughts. So it may have played a role in the history of science. We don't know how extensive this could be and whether we've just opened a huge Pandora's box of phenomena.
It's fascinating. Of course, Robert Bigelow, the famous businessman, invested a lot of money in Skinwalker Ranch and NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science, and many of the top scientists to go out and study these phenomena. And they all seem to kind of interweave, the UFOs, the aports, to strange appearances, apparitions. They all seem to kind of interweave. And, they left, as far as we know, they left Skinwalker Ranch mystified. As far as we know, they didn't come out with any, final conclusions. And when you look at the hearts, this ATIP report, what the government is concerned about, all of those things seem like the same kind of things that you see at Skinwalker Ranch. And it makes me wonder that there's a physical mechanism that the mind is able to manipulate, some sort of real physical aspect of reality that it's able to manipulate. And the alien question makes me wonder, is technology able to recreate what the human mind can do? Is it possible to technologically recreate PK? And that's what it makes me wonder. Not just that the creatures aboard the craft may, of course, have incredibly highly developed PK. But have you personally ever experienced PK? Have you ever tried an experiment and after several attempts found yourself to have surprising results?
Well, I don't know to what extent I'm responsible for what I've observed, but it's what got me into parapsychology in the first place. In graduate school, I watched my own table rise in the air and spell out answers in response to questions. So at the time, I was too busy writing a dissertation in temporal logic and trying to get a PhD and get a job to really come to grips with it. And I didn't mention it to my mentors. That would have been suicide. So I waited till I got a job, published conventional mainstream research in logic and the philosophy of time, and got tenure. So I may be crazy, but I'm not stupid.
You're very wise to not have thrown everything into the parapsychology bucket right off the bat. So you were touching the table and it rose and it spelled out stuff.
Right.
What was that experience like for you? Was
Scared
that
the shit out of me?
Wow, I can imagine. I can imagine. How did you do it more than once? If it was so scary.
Well, I didn't follow up on it much after the immediate incident. I did it for 3 hours that time.
Wow.
So I had plenty of time to watch it. I was doing it with two friends. If one of my friends went to the other room temporarily, we were still standing by the table and the table was rising underneath our fingers. So we weren't lifting it with our legs. It was broad daylight. It was my table. It was my apartment. It was pretty compelling at the time. And I've since seen quite a bit more. I've seen table levitations elsewhere since.
The Sorat group, SORRAT group, where they have, I think, even some videos on YouTube still of the table rising. What do you think is involved there? Is it the same kind of quandary? Is it the participants? Is it the experimenters? Is it spiritual? Is it PK? What
If
is
it's just tilting, it's more ambiguous. If it's a full table levitation, it's certainly more impressive. But even a table tilt under the right conditions can be very impressive. I was recently investigating a subject in Buenos Aires named Ariel Farias, who under very good conditions makes tables rise under his hands.
Yeah, I saw the video of that. It's a big table too. It's not a small little one of those little TV dinner tables.
No, it's a 30-pound table. There are a couple of articles about Ariel in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, so if people want to follow up on that. It's been in the past few years.
Are there any other very gifted psychics or PK practitioners that you are aware of now anywhere in the world? Really powerful ones?
There are a lot of claimants, most of them in a spiritist context, people who are claiming to be physical mediums of one kind or another. But nobody who's producing really compelling results or allowing themselves to be tested under really good conditions, say with infrared cameras. They still like to work in the dark. They refuse infrared recording. So at the moment, there's nobody who's bowling me over.
Are you familiar with the famous China's psychic spies? That big book about the different experiments done in China and with everyone from children to the famous psychics there, and the amazing.
I'm aware of some Qigong practitioners testing children and also demonstrating phenomena themselves. I don't know that literature very well.
There's some amazing cases of basically objects passing in and out of sealed test tubes inside of a safe, things like that, which seem to be so extraordinary. I mean, if this stuff is as real as it seems, if you do the basic research, it seems like it's incredibly difficult to fake a lot of these different results across this spectrum. And that if this is real, the ability for the mind to physically change matter, to move matter, to penetrate matter, to literally, in a way, shatter reality in some context, and do something that completely defies normal logic. It's really an intense thought.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who are doing these various kinds of investigations are so widely separated and not talking to one another or communicating with one another. So we've got these various splinter groups doing interesting stuff. And I think there'd be more answers forthcoming if only society were more amenable to bringing the stuff out into the open, where the channels of communication would be easier.
It's interesting how Luis Elizondo from ATIP said that his direct boss said that this stuff was all evil and satanic, and and that's just based on UFOs. Imagine how evangelicals would feel about exploring this topic. They would certainly see it as a satanic, and that's got to be a hindrance to the real research into this stuff.
Except when Christ did it, it was okay.
Exactly right. I love that. It's such a wonderful analogy. That's beautiful. Do you have, do you know of any research institutes or places that are studying PK? Anyone aside from Dean Radin, who's doing psi research at that level?
Dean does very creative work, but there was a time when I first got into all of this in the late 70s and early 80s. There were lots of labs doing PK research. There were even 3 labs just in Texas. But money dried up. The experiments didn't really continue to lead anywhere in particular. And I think in some ways that's because laboratory research is almost ludicrously premature at this point. I mean, if we don't know what kind of ability we're trying to bring into the lab to study, it may be as inappropriate for laboratory study as it would be to study sensuality in the lab.
Great
and since we have really no firm grip on what the natural history of psychic functioning is, what role it's playing in everyday life, what its evolutionary value or role may be, we have no idea really whether it's even appropriate to try to harness it in the way necessary for traditional laboratory investigations.
That's
I
a
think
great,
we need better anthropologists still at this point.
that's a great point. If you had $1 billion to research this topic, how would you get at it? How would you approach it? Would
Wow.
would you approach it from a more contextual basis first, like you were saying, and then break it down into experiments over time, or?
Well, I'd certainly spend more time in the field, but I guess I've avoided thinking about that just because it would be too frustrating to imagine what I could do if only I had the money.
Yeah, fascinating. Are you working on any books now? Are you working on, I mean, you have a incredible um, catalog of really interesting stuff that covers a range of, parapsychology, and then like your multiple personalities work as well. You really have an interesting spectrum of work.
Thank you. I may be booked out. I don't know. I do have a manuscript on suppositories that I'm still thinking of writing. It's called Up Yours,
Well, you're just
An Illustrated History of Suppositories, but
wow.
striking out in new directions.
You're the comedian. You're the comedian now. Wow. You are very good at comedy too, my friend. I have a comedy background. I've been on some of the comedy
Yeah,
shows. Yeah. And so you've been giving good comedy to the right guy.
it helps if you're a teacher.
No, I bet to keep the audience's attention like that. What to you is the most exciting aspect of parapsychology? Is there an aspect that still makes you excited every day that you have an interest in?
Well, I'm somewhat jaded at this point, but I still get excited when I see a good phenomenon. So when I went to Buenos Aires to watch Ariel, I mean, it's cool to watch the table go up under his hand.
I
No
bet.
doubt about it.
Did you ever get to witness any of the big names? Uri Geller, or did you ever meet Ted? Um,
Well, I've met Ted Sirios, not Ted Owens.
hmm.
Do you know who Ted Sirios is? He
Yes.
was the guy who produced images on Polaroid film. So I
But
spent some time with him.
didn't he do
Yeah,
it like
right.
this? Yeah,
Gizmo.
the Gizmo. How do you
But
think that could have been PK too, right?
absolutely, PK. I mean, he didn't always use the gizmo. He often produced the phenomena while it's locked in a sealed Faraday cage and not even touching the camera, and that at a distance from the camera.
And wasn't he always smashed too? Didn't he?
Absolutely.
He
Yeah.
liked. It's so funny how different people take different approaches. I'm someone who researches this stuff and practices, and there's so many different philosophies. So many people are like, oh, you have to be tranquil and you have to clear out the material world and all this stuff. But people have challenge. I find that the more you add impediments, the more it gives you strength. Like lifting weights. And I've had some of my best readings during very difficult times. I was in Newark Airport, and a group of people called me from a UFO convention that I was on my way to, and they'd heard that I was a remote viewer, and like, oh, remote view this object that's in front of somebody right now, and I'm being jostled by everybody, and I didn't, according to him, 95% accuracy of the camera and camera strap
Cool.
and everything, but it's the total opposite of what you would think. You'd think it'd be calmness and everything like that, and
I think for some people it is.
and other
I
people
think
it's
it's totally
getting
idiosyncratic.
yeah, yeah. I guess it's an
And it's what you'd expect. I mean, most human abilities are totally idiosyncratic. I mean, that's why I say it's premature to bring the stuff into the lab and treat people as if they're mere emitters of psychic functioning, as if there aren't complex psychological processes that are involved in doing this kind of thing.
yeah.
I mean, it's easy for some people to sing in front of others or fart in front of others. My students would call this the fart factor in psi research.
It's funny because like you exactly, if you brought into a lab Sirius, you wouldn't think that getting hammered would be normal laboratory protocols.
Right. For him, it helped.
Yeah. And I find like for me, the few rare occasions that I've gone gambling, I've gone smashed myself and done incredibly well too. That way I figured, for me, it was psychologically, it was like, well, I'm going to have fun either way, but interesting.
Well, so you didn't have too much psychologically invested in failing or succeeding. So that takes you off the hook. I think that's a huge factor in succeeding in this area.
it's interesting too. There's a lot of people. There's something called CE5, which is a protocol to attract UFOs, and it's a meditation protocol. And a lot of
Okay.
people do that protocol very seriously, where they go vegetarian for 7 to 10 days before an event, and they purify their bodies and go through all sorts of different things. And other people will actually dose on different minor hallucinogens and things like that, and have success in a group context, but not the whole group is doing hallucinogens. So it's interesting how the mind, it's really an individual function. It all seems to me to be coming from the mind, from the power of thought, from intention, maybe even from subconsciousness more than consciousness. Is that your feeling too? It's coming more from the subconscious than the conscious mind?
That's my hunch. I don't think we know that for sure. I think, again, that to some extent it may be idiosyncratic, but it's one of the reasons I've often recommended that if we want to see what the natural history of PK is, we should look at people who are remarkably lucky or unlucky. And in particular, I think it's helpful to look at really, really unlucky people. I mean, there's an old Yiddish distinction between a schlemiel and a schlemazel. A schlemiel is someone who spills soup on himself, and a schlemazel has it spilled on him. So the idea is that a schlemazel is an unlucky soul, a victim of the universe at large, or that the universe is crapping on one way or another. And they really exist. I mean, I was once married to a woman who was part of a family of schlemazels. I mean, they seem to be lightning rods for misfortune. I'd rather not discuss that case for various reasons, but I once lived next door to some schlemazels, and this was a married couple, and I wish I knew where they were now, and I wish I could find out if they were schlemazels before they got married. But their life was a living hell of aggravations and annoyances. So it seemed as almost everything they bought was defective. Electronic equipment would fail to work right out of the box. Their cars were always in the shop, even though they both had Hondas.
Wow, and Hondas
A
are
solid wooden rocking chair broke in the first day of ownership with their infant son on it. And my favorite example of their schlemazelness, if that's even a word, the wife bought a poster-sized photograph of what she thought was the Golden Gate Bridge, and she had it framed and put on her living room wall. And I had to tell her, Donna, that's the Brooklyn Bridge. So here's a woman who both literally and figuratively bought the Brooklyn Bridge.
And literally, she bought the bridge.
Right.
This is stunning stuff when you really, if you believe it, and you obviously believe all of this stuff is real, correct?
Yes. Well, when you say all of this stuff, I believe that the phenomena are real. That doesn't mean in every case where there seem to be phenomena.
And it's such a, it's so counterintuitive. Our whole lives, we're taught, we're experienced that reality is a certain way. And the fact that the mind can change reality in really stunning ways that kind of defy science, it goes to the very nature of reality. Is reality just matter, or is reality a combination of matter and consciousness? And is that, combination really what we're dealing with? And that's why this phenomena is more real than we thought, because we think of it more as just a materialistic world. We don't take into consciousness as an integral part of the fabric of reality as maybe it really truly is.
Well, it's why I said earlier that it triggers the fear of psi, because we don't really know how to integrate this into a worldview. Because if we take stuff seriously, it suggests that this primitive worldview, where the mind can be active across a wide spectrum of circumstances, that may be the correct view, and the more mechanistic worldview of modern science is actually a kind of retreat from the real nature of causality, which is based in agency, human agency.
And you know what? It means that our thoughts, we need to be a lot more responsible about our thoughts because they affect the world. They affect people around you. They affect the universe.
Yes. But we can't so easily control our subconscious, and that's where the real action may be happening, and that's why it can be so scary, and that's why I think people blanch at the very idea that this stuff could be real. I have found that the resistance to my talking about PK is much stronger than the resistance to my talking about ESP.
It's interesting how PK really is the lowest of the low in the parapsychological world. I mean, you can talk about ESP, you can talk about intuition. You say
Right,
intuition, everyone can jump aboard. You cross into
right.
ESP, you start to lose people. You say psychic, and they're running, and you say PK, and the room's empty. Um,
Yeah,
um, but they all are real. They all are indisputably real. Um,
I agree.
Stunning. Well, Dr. Braude, I can't tell you how much we appreciate your time and your insights. It's so rare to get someone talk about these topics with as much knowledge and authority as you do, and make people like me feel less nutty for exploring these thoughts and believing in them. And we would love the possibility of maybe chatting again in the future, if that's.
Sure, we can do that. That'd be my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Braude. And is there anything you'd like to promote, a website or your books, where they can get copies of your books?
Well, most of them are still available on Amazon and elsewhere. Check out the website for the Society for Scientific Exploration and the Journal of Scientific Exploration. It's an open access journal, so all the issues can be viewed and downloaded.
That's great. That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Braude. Really appreciate your time and your comedy as well.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.